And joining us now on what the Iran war means for China, Stefano Ritondale, a former military intelligence specialist, now the chief intelligence officer at Artorias. Research fellow at the Hudson Institute, Zainab Ribua, writes that the Trump administration is, quote, dismantling a pillar of China's regional architecture by attacking Iran. So much focus, so many of the analysts we speak to have felt that this Iran story is really about China. Do you see it this way?
I think the Chinese piece is an important component of this. Obviously, this has broader implications, not only for the Middle East, but the world in our competition with China. I think it's important to note that one of the main reasons why the United States is kind of tied down into the Middle East, specifically from a diplomatic, economic, but more importantly, military perspective, is because of Iran. And the Islamic Republic is one of the main reasons why we have tens of thousands of American soldiers deployed there. Now, the argument can be made that with the toppling of the Islamic Republic, and then maybe putting in a friendly, Western-friendly government in Iran, that would significantly reduce our requirement for a significant military presence in the Middle East and enable us to kind of pivot into the Indo-Pacific, which has been a goal since the Obama administration. And every time we try to do that, obviously, the Middle East kind of sucks us back in, but it's also mostly because of Iran as well. And so by removing the Ayatollahs, it does enable us to kind of refocus on China. And also China loses their only major key regional ally in the Middle East. I mean, obviously, China has various large-scale business dealings with a lot of countries, to include Saudi Arabia. But from a geopolitical sense, Iran is their primary partner in the Middle East. And losing Iran, losing that geopolitical partner, significantly weakens Chinese influence in the region. And clearly, I think the Trump administration is looking at that and trying to slowly pick off all of Chinese allies across the world.
It certainly looks that way. How does the Chinese Communist Party specifically benefit from Iran?
Well, from a lot of aspects, they benefit. One, obviously, from the economic trade and the oil trade, although China has a lot of influence with that, with a lot of the countries in the region. But Iran, most of their oil is sold directly to China, and specifically through their shadow fleet. So they're able to leverage, try to bust sanctions and send a lot of it at a discounted price for China, where China obviously gets an advantage. And the other aspects as well is Iran has always been kind of one of these key geopolitical and military partners of China, and more importantly with Russia. And so a lot of the lessons learned that Iran has, both from their drones and their ballistic missile capabilities, just as they gave and shared that with the Russians shortly before and after their invasion of Ukraine, you can also see them kind of doing something very similar for China if China decides to launch an operation, an invasion of Taiwan. And so Iran has a lot of those capabilities that can be able to support. And it's also in leverage, as I alluded in the past, because the United States has a significant amount of military forces deployed into the Middle East because of the Iranian regime, China benefits from that. And the Iran has always been something that allows China to kind of operate freely in the Eastern Pacific while the United States is consumed with the Middle East. So by removing Iran, by removing the Islamic Republic, it will allow us to really prioritize the Indo-Pacific, and that is specifically geared towards China.
Certainly. And how much do you think the timing could impact China's appetite for taking Taiwan?
I think that's the million-dollar question. Obviously, the United States operation last month in Venezuela and now what we're seeing in Iran, you can always tie them from a geopolitical sense at China, because both of these are key players and key allies and economic partners and oil partners for China. I think there's a lot of things that are going on inside of China that is really limiting their ability to launch an offensive against Taiwan. We've seen recently Xi Jinping continue his purges. Basically now the Chinese military commission is only formed by Xi Jinping and a lower ranking political general. So really a lot of the military aspects right now, we're not really seeing any indication that is imminent. The key question is 2027, Xi Jinping has made it clear that he wanted at least to have the military capabilities to launch it, not necessarily a deadline that it was definitely going to happen. I think the loss of Iran in the region can make China kind of think twice. And more importantly, both the operation in Venezuela and what we're seeing now in Iran are clear demonstrations of America's military might. And I think China and Xi Jinping might look at that and say, we might not be ready for 2027. We need to continue to develop and expand our forces. But as long as Xi Jinping is focused on these constant purges, China might not never get to the point where even Xi Jinping feels comfortable enough to launch an offensive or an invasion on Taiwan.
Yeah, regardless of Iran, it does look, the regime in China looks to be weakening, at least from the outside. But looking now back on Iran, China's been selling tech to Iran for years, enabling repression there. It's even being used in this war. But how big of a role has China played in Iran's tech and weapons development?
I mean, the ballistic missile program is wholeheartedly dependent on China and a lot of the components in their text, as they alluded to, and a lot of the missile components. China is a primary backer of Iran's military and their ballistic missile program and their drones. And a lot of the sanctions that have kind of impacted Iran, they are able to leverage Chinese companies to kind of evade that and continue their military buildup. Clearly, the United States, with their strikes with Israel against Iran, they're kind of seeing that. It would be very interesting to get further reporting on a lot of these missiles and drones that are kind of being picked up across the regions. More than likely, a lot of those components that made up those equipments came from China specifically. And I think it would just continue to demonstrate how China has been a key backer of Iran, both politically, economically, and militarily. But the ballistic missile program specifically is very dependent on China. And we're seeing how much of a risk that has been. And obviously, the United States, rightfully so, is viewing that ballistic missile as the primary threat that they want to destroy.
Certainly. And despite that partnership you've just outlined, China is not currently coming to Iran's aid materially. Will China lose some of its reputation in the eyes of some of its strategic partners?
You know, I'm going to be honest. I mean, I think China is the most unreliable ally or partner that country can have. I mean, China has never really lifted a finger for any of the countries. We saw this with who China claimed their, quote, all-weather ally is Pakistan. And when Pakistan got into a conflict with India, China was a minimal player that barely got involved. The latest round that Pakistan has had with the Afghan Taliban, the Chinese provided no support outside of just maybe diplomatic statements. I mean, it's been very well known that China is not a reliable partner. It's not a reliable ally. And this latest incidents with not only last month with Venezuela, but more importantly, Iran, where China clearly has a much more geopolitical interest in Iran. The fact that China is doing absolutely nothing outside of just statements from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs demonstrate that they're unreliable. And so any country around there, from Russia, Iran, North Korea, Cuba, they all know that if the United States wants something and is dedicated to do military operations against you, China is not going to come to your rescue. And really, it really hits the image of China as a reliable ally, partner, or even global actor.
Now, President Trump is expected to hold a summit with Chinese leader Xi Jinping in a few weeks. Do you think this conflict in Iran will impact those negotiations?
I think it could have an impact. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of things that the United States and China need to deal with in a bilateral sense. And obviously, even Xi Jinping, as we alluded to earlier, is much more focused on the internal dynamics of inside of China from an economic perspective and his purges in the military and the CCP. So I think China right now is in a position of very much inward looking. And I think that President Trump is going to take advantage of that to really try to isolate the Iran component. And maybe something to say, well, this is an area where we agree to disagree, but we can focus specifically on bilateral aspects, either, militarily or even economic. And I think that's going to be the main focus of these conversations, the economic and the tariffs and the trade deals. And I think President Trump, because the United States and Israel has such an upper hand in the current conflict with Iran, China really is not in a position to put anything against the United States or demand something in return or put pressure on the United States. So I think China has abandoned the Iranians. They're not going to really bring that up outside of a broad sense of they want regional stability. And the United States-Chinese negotiations are really going to focus primarily on the economic front.
Well, it's fascinating to watch these developments with your insight. Thank you so much for your time today, Stefano Ritondale.
Thank you so much for having me.